Ethics the short way. The question mark is meant sincerely. After all, I do not believe that we should do with business ethics the short way in the literal sense. But we could and we should keep it short. That's what I'll try now. There is a constitutive controversy in business ethics. This is the controversy about stakeholder and shareholder approaches. To get a feeling for this, let's consider certain concrete contract situations. Here is a case. Assume you are the manager who has been hired by an entrepreneur who owns a firm. Then you, the manager, has a contract with the entrepreneur. Since you have a contract, you have a moral obligation to pursue the aims, ends or values of your principal, the entrepreneur. After all, you did not enter the contract point of the gun. You had other options, at least that's what I assume, and so you could act otherwise. Once you have accepted the contract, you are bound to your promise within the limits of legitimate law. If the principal's aim is environmental protection, then that is what you have to do as his agent. He hired you because he could not foresee all the details of later management situations, and he trusts in you that you will do what seems fit to pursuing this aim. If the aim of the manager is protecting jobs, then this is what you have to do to the best of your knowledge. And if it is earning as much money as possible, then obviously this is what you have to do. Why? Nobody is forced to enter an employment contract. As I said, you did not enter it point of the gun. So if you promise in a contract, but this is also coming along with the moral obligation to play by the clauses of the contract, then the moral obligations or the contract clauses are morally binding, at least in principle, for you. As long as we accept some privilege of ownership in a free contract society, and that is what we must do if we live in a modern Western society, the previous argument seems to be rather compelling, and it's hard to see how one can avoid the conclusion stipulated there. Now assume you are a manager who has to act as an agent of the principals of a large company with wide circulation of shares. As before, you have a contract with the company. You have a moral obligation to pursue the aims, ends or values of the principals, within the limits of legitimate law, of course. The principals, however, will pursue not one but many values. They would not necessarily all want the same thing. And then you are faced with a problem. You can't serve them all equally. Even with the single entrepreneur, you had the problem of trading off conflicting values that he might have. The opportunity costs of, say, an increase in environmental protection could have been the reduction of job safety or job security, or even the number of jobs. Now you may have principals who want, say, more environmental protection, and others want more profit. And again, there may be a trade-off. You can't serve them all at max, so to say. So what can you do? I believe, the only compromise open to somebody who wants to respect equally all the people to whom he gave a promise is to keep the share value up. Because then people can sell their shares. The higher the value, the better can they pursue their own aims, ends and values with the money they get. They can invest it in another company that is closer to their own concerns. Or they can use it themselves to give the money to an NGO if they have such aims, ends or values. Or they can do whatever they want with the money, for instance also consume the money for something they want to buy. And this, after all, is also a legitimate concern. Let's sum this up with the statement that there is not one conception of moral value, but always a plurality. Only some ethicists seem to believe that the values that they happen to share are, presumably therefore, objectively valid and must be imposed on everybody. However, as the world lies, it is very clear that people have very different values. They don't agree. Disagreement, plurality of values, dissent rather than consent is what characterizes our world. After we have seen a moral argument in favor of a shareholder conception of legitimate action, which is typically associated with the name of Milton Friedman, we now turn to an alternative conception. It's also a moral conception. However, note carefully that the shareholder conception was a moral rather than a merely economic or business conception of what the management should do. Here is the alternative moral theory. Shareholders are not the only stakeholders whose interests matter, and therefore one cannot go for shareholder value per se. There are conflicting interests in the company, and the priority of shareholder value must be denied for ethical reasons. There are competing ethical reasons, and there is no clear priority of ownership. And the reason why that is so is more or less that within a moral approach, as defined by Freeman, the management has to ignore the privilege of ownership and to treat all interests morally on a par. After all, the manager is a moral subject, and as a moral subject, the manager has moral obligations and cannot subject his own judgment to some obligation to pursue the aims, ends or values of her or his principal. To this, Friedman's opponents typically add that he looks at all the other stakeholders of the company as mere instruments to the shareholder interests by prioritizing shareholder value. And this is what may be called a Kantian claim, because Kant emphasized that we should never use another person as a mere instrument of our own pursuits. The company should be seen as if it were an outcome of fair contracts among all stakeholders. That is, it is not an instrument to increase share value, or rather to further the aims, ends or values of the principals or owners. It is something else. It is to be looked at as a fair contract among all stakeholders, including villages that are in the environment of a production plant, the customers, everybody. And in the end, it is the manager who has to find a fair compromise on behalf of all these interests within his or her discretionary powers. The reason is, as before, the manager is always a moral person and therefore has to act as a moral person, and this means for Freeman, which is not of course self-evident, that one has to be respectful to all stakeholders. In that regard, actually, Freeman and Friedman are in some aspects on the same plane. After all, Friedman was of the opinion that the shareholders all deserved equal respect. More generally speaking, Friedman and Freeman are quite close to each other. This can be illustrated by a few examples. If somebody, in pursuing the increase of share value, would treat employees and customers badly, he would really make the interests of the principals or of the company as a whole suffer. One would shoot oneself in one's own foot. Treating employees and customers according to moral norms is typically instrumental to the success of the firm. Unless you are treating people reasonably and respectfully, they will just turn around and leave the company or be away as customers and so on. Those who are treated as mere means to shareholders' ends will leave the company, at least if they feel that this is the case. Customers who feel badly treated will not buy again, and those who have subscribed a contract with the company and feel treated badly will go away. The war for talent will be lost by this company. Leaving this to the listeners, here are a few general lessons that can be drawn from the preceding and are worth emphasizing. Doing well by doing good is a very useful slogan. By doing the morally right thing, as a rule, you will also further your pecuniary or monetary interests. In this way, what may be called bread and butter morals, common sense morals, are instrumentally justified. In your pursuit of profit, or your pursuit of revenue, or your pursuit of increasing shareholder value, these are the material gains measured by the doing well clause, you do actually the right thing if you just follow common sense morals. This is instrumental to further the aims of the company. We know proverbial slogans like honesty is the best policy. Of course, there will be temptations when it seems to be absolutely clear that a little or slight deviation from full honesty cannot be observed, say, by a customer or by an employee or whatever is the addressee of your actions, but you may be found out, or it is very hard to discriminate the golden from the non-golden opportunities and so on. So on the whole, presumably a maxim to be honest is good policy and presumably the best policy, at least for boundedly rational human individuals who are prone to make mistakes. they better bind themselves to some strict ethical rule, so that they are not tempted by seeming opportunities. In general, it is very important to note that what has been called obliquity by John Kay, one of the British management gurus, applies almost across the board. That is, if you want to achieve a certain aim and or value, it is more often than not the case that you cannot directly reach it. You can directly reach it only if it's a very simple and typically short-term and close by. Otherwise, you have to look at the long term, and to reach your aims, ends or values in the long term, you more often than not have to act very indirectly. That is, you act upon ethical maxims to reach your long-term ends. By not looking at revenue, you may increase your revenue. By not looking at the revenue in a single case, by forgiving a little money now, you may increase your monetary rewards in the future. Each simple investment is of that kind, but it has much more oblique, more indirect variance. It is morally doubtful to pursue moral aims, ends or values against long-term shareholder interest if the preceding argument is true. However, most measures that you would take in a company can possibly be chosen to further long-term interests. The relationships between profit over the long term and what you do now are very, very complicated. And since the world is so complicated, we can pursue many alternative courses of actions towards the end we have, the long-term end. Nevertheless, once you have very good reason to assume that you are violating the long-term interests of your shareholders, you act in a morally illegitimate way if you accept the argument from promise-keeping and privilege of ownership laid out before. There's a remedy for that. Companies can declare their aims openly. So you could found a company that is pursuing certain moral ends. You are a politically correct investor, or you have a very nice investment fund that does all the nice things that some people desire you to do, then you should do that. And I mean this without irony. You are serving a demand. If people don't buy your shares, well, that's fine too. That's how the market works. As long as there is no deception involved, it would be legitimate. If you want to install or set up a so-called wise fund that invests in all the things that are declared vices by most moral systems, like gambling or drinking alcohol, smoking, and the other fun things in our life, then that's what you can do. You declare it openly, and nobody needs to buy the stuff. However, if you say, we will not invest in certain morally doubtful things, then you should not do it. And if you do it, you deceive others and your honesty is lacking. To ask management in concealed ways in pursuit of certain aims, ends or values asks actually for deception. So if somebody approaches the management and tells the management that he or she thinks that certain values are clearly the values that should be pursued, and does so knowing, and everybody must know this, that not everybody shares these values, then this can be done legitimately only by the management if the management openly declares that it is now following the new ethical guru. Mention again, there is no consent on the common weal or common good. People, of course, claim that they know what the common good is. However, almost as many claims are there as there are people. Everybody wants that the common good is furthered. Everybody declares that the common weal should be supported. However, if you ask specifically how it should be furthered, the unanimity is gone. The consent is over. There are only several claims that all try to hijack the common good concept. Dissent rather than consent prevails. Those who claim that there is an ideal consent, and here in Frankfurt there is another Frankfurt school that does so, are actually only using this notion as a rule in general to impose their own views. Their own views may be right. I don't deny that they sometimes have interesting moral aspirations that many of us may share. However, if they want a management to do this without declaring it openly, then they are engaging in strategies that induce other people to engage in deception. Since it is so complicated to find the right means towards the end of increasing shareholder value, or for that matter profit maximization, there is a wide scope for choosing instruments towards these ends. Even if the preceding argument was amounting to supporting a shareholder view, the difference to a stakeholder view is not very large in practice. More often than not, it is in the interest of the shareholders that the management acts as if pursuing a strategy that amounts to endorsing a stakeholder view. This, I believe, is more or less the reflective equilibrium on the controversy between shareholders and stakeholders. Now we turn more systematically on the central ethical tool, a very trivial ethical tool that we have for solving practical problems. It is searching for a coherent approach that is based on as general principles as we can find. Here's the basic idea of the reflective equilibrium search. We should test ethical principles and theories of ethics broadly in the same ways as we test scientific theories. The original intuition was science is progressing, ethics is not progressing, so let's make ethics as similar to science as possible. Now this will not be possible as far as direct observation and test of theories is concerned. However, we can model the dialogue or discourse on controversial matters according to the model of science. And this science is, we have general principles and we test them against specific intuitions. We start from the basic premise that the progressive character, that it is going forward, of science is more closely related to this interplay between the general and the specific. And we substitute observations and the objectivity in science by basic intuitions. Here's the basic example. You look out of the window and you see the killing of a person. You have an intuition that this is wrong. You reject that, you resent that. You generalize and say, well, that seems to be so because killing is wrong in general. So you form a first general principle: killing is wrong. Now you are confronted with somebody attacking you. Say you sit somewhere, have just cleaned your gun, have your gun on your lap, and it's loaded, everything is fine, and somebody is attacking you with an axe. Is it wrong to kill the attacker? Presumably you would say, no, that's intuitively right. I have the right to defend myself. So you conclude that you have to modify your general principle 1, because it can't be true that killing is wrong, period. Your new principle, principle 2, is killing is wrong except in cases of self-defense. So you have a general principle and you have specific situations, and you try to make the whole thing coherent. Now you are attacked by somebody who has an egg in his hand. You don't know whether this is a hard-boiled or soft egg, but in both cases I guess you would say this is clearly not a real risk to your life. Still, you have your gun. May you kill the person who is attacking you with an egg? Well, let's assume it's a raw egg. You know that it's a raw egg. Most of us would say it's not adequate that you defend your personal integrity with the gun. You conclude that principle 2 must be modified. Your new principle is something like killing is wrong except in cases of self-defense that require such a measure of defense as you choose to prevent a very serious evil threatening the attacked. Now, let's be careful here. Now come into play difficult matters of judgment. What if it's a hard-boiled ostrich egg, or if it's an egg made of concrete? So there are many variants here and gray zones. Nevertheless, it seems rather clear how to go over these cases. You have a kind of casuistry, and you have on the other hand general principles, and you try to form a system in which the case solutions that you intuitively regard to be as adequate, and you balance these solutions with general principles. You can go on and on. The etc. is something you can fill in yourself. The crucial thing why this is called reflective equilibrium is the metaphor of the Roman arc. In a Roman arc, the stones hold each other in the air, and they wouldn't be in the air if the other stones wouldn't be there. And in the same way, you construct a system like a Roman arc in which the general and the specific stones or principles hold each other. Searching for a reflective equilibrium is something that must be trained in practice. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, you could say, but what you really should do is you should go back and search for reflective equilibrium solutions of cases, and if you need model cases, you could go to the script where you find the whistleblowing case, the dumping waste and letting off people case, and you might also go to the short selling as a moral issue case, and you may think of other cases that you would want to deal with. So exercise with these model cases, and then you should be fine and prepared for real ethical tasks. This is something to be discussed in class or among colleagues. Nothing that is really suitable for a presentation per se. What was described before was just common sense and hopefully not nonsense on stilts. It was not common sense on stilts, it was just common sense laundered a bit and clarified. However, ethics has to contribute something to this. You might want to slip certain ethical theories into your equilibrium search. You have some information about what ethical theories say, and you use it to systematize better your understandings as expressed in your reflective equilibrium search, or the equilibrium you may find. Ethical theories. There are consequentialist ethical theories, and they are split up into act consequentialist and rule consequentialist theories. Then there are non-consequentialist ethical theories, and they split up again into act and rule non-consequentialist conceptions. This is basically it. And it is very abstract, so let's make it a bit more specific. If you go to the consequentialist theories that are act consequentialist, something like act utilitarianism should come to your mind. A utilitarian position is one that tries to seek the maximum sum of good consequences for all individuals or all sentient beings affected. That of course requires that you can sum up in some meaningful way a measure of the consequences. It must be possible, for instance, to add up the utility for Mr. A with the disutility of Mrs. B, and then see whether the sum is positive or negative. That seems to be rather strong, and each act should be evaluated in terms of the consequences then. Think of it this way. If you are considering a decathlon, then there is the high jump, there is pole jump, there is the 100-meter dash, and so on. You would have to be able to say how much a centimeter in the high jump is in tenths of a second in the 100-meter dash to sum the whole thing up. And this problem, the decathlon problem, shows up whenever you have to aggregate consequences across individuals. Whether that is legitimate or not can be studied with things like the trolley problem. Act utilitarians look at each act taken separately. They are maximizers in the same sense as an economist says you should maximize the consequences of each act taken separately as measured in profit. The rule utilitarians are different. They say you should act according to a rule. The rule tells you what to do. However, the rule itself is justified by the utility it creates. So the rule, honesty is the best policy, will create, if the sentence is true, higher utility if you observe it by being honest than an alternative rule. Make exceptions and lie whenever it's convenient. Whether that's true or not is largely an empirical matter. However, it is rather plausible that often just following the rules without calculating in each instance what is the right thing to do is the better strategy. In rule utilitarianism, this is of course extended to interpersonal rules, like promise keeping, and not only to personal maxims. It is on the whole better for me if I'm honest. This is a personal maxim or rule. The rules are often justified by their social or collective utility, which means that a society in which people keep their promises works better than a society in which they do not keep their promises. Then let's go to the next branch, to the non-consequentialist positions. A position that says you have to make your existential decisions just as a matter of gut feelings. This is something which hits you as adequate in a certain situation, and then you do it. This is one possibility. I won't go over this. This is an act consequentialist one. You just think, act non-consequentialist one. This is something which seems to be appropriate, whatever the consequences. It hits you right between the eyes. Rule Kantianism is something which is different. It's rule non-consequentialism, and it's rule following in the sense of following, say, the categorical imperative, and I called it rule Kantianism, which is of course a bit strange. Kantianism is always associated with rules, and there are rules that are right in themselves, independently of the consequences. It is right to follow these rules, and you actually don't have to look at the consequences the rule-following behavior would have if the rule would be institutionalized or something like this. This is strict Kantianism, and it is, to put it mildly, rather implausible, at least to somebody like me. Nevertheless, this is another really non-consequentialist position. Are these positions very different from each other? Well, if you look at things in terms of specific institutions, then rule utilitarian justifications and Kantian justifications that look at the utility of the rule-following behavior obviously are in the same camp. This is all again about indirect pursuits of interests. I leave it to those who listen to this very brief presentation to think a bit about these things, and then perhaps to look up the relevant passages in Frankener. In our personal life, I think we are confronted with two things. We want to do the right thing, and often we are concerned about the motives why we do it. We are not full consequentialists. We appreciate the motives, the intentions that people have. It is evaluated differently if something is done in pursuit of monetary gains, even though the monetary gains stand for something that will be in the common interest. The common interest is incentivized, so to say, and on the other hand you have somebody who does it for altruistic reasons. That is not to say that altruism is always a good thing. Altruism is more often than not actually a bad thing. If you think of the suicide bomber and other examples of altruism, then you immediately see that all the great crimes, or most of them, are conducted out of altruism. People self-sacrifice, sometimes even the masses self-sacrifice, or they self-sacrifice in sacrificing others. Think of the Nazi or the communist area. In our everyday life, we are interested in acts that are right and conducted for good motives. Acts are right if they are in conformity with the categorical imperative, or at least they are not wrong then, says the Kantian. That's an example. And acts are good if the motive is good. And this is in Kant, just to say this also, the pure goodwill. And the pure goodwill is not something in terms of consequences. It's really goodwill means I want to do the right thing. I'm motivated by pure moral concerns of generalizability. Still, let me remind you, good acts exist for which we have no duty, and heroes and saints do that. Heroes and saints are presumably the wrong examples, the wrong role models for sound morals. After listening to all this, does it really help? Well, it will help if rules would have overriding force. Now think of a typical ethical maxim popular in Germany. Act only on that maxim of which you can at the same time will to be a universal law. Does that really tell you much about what you are going to do in a concrete situation? Do you have an answer, or is it as unspecific as the advice to maximize profits? Because if somebody tells you, please maximize profits, you don't know what you have to do. You have to find out. The whole trick is to find out how to maximize profits and not to find out that one should do this. Now, are there things where we can really know what to do without having to look at all the complicated consequences and making all these instrumental considerations crucial? Here's the Kantian example. Truth-telling. To tell lies is always wrong, says Kant. Yet, the question is obvious. May we lie to the murderer who on his way to the victim asked us where the victim is? We are, by this question, out of an initial reflective equilibrium. We thought lies are always wrong. Now, Kant is totally undisturbed. He would say, yes, we have to tell the truth. Why could he have such a strange view? I believe he thought the world is so complicated that we need some real strong maxims, and we shouldn't engage in all these case-by-case calculations, but rather follow strict rules. Now that would be an indirectly utilitarian justification of the Kantian thought, which he himself tries to avoid. It's indirectly utilitarian because it argues in terms of good consequences that would emerge from binding ourselves to very strict rules. Other ethical positions would say it is a rule that is only prima facie valid. It is very strong, however, the burden of proof can be discharged, and we can say against this burden of proof rule it is sometimes legitimate to tell lies. Then we indirectly argue in terms of consequences, and that brings us back to consequentialism. Whether an act is right or wrong is determined by the causal consequences of that act. That is act consequentialist. Go back to the graph before. Or it is determined by the causal consequences of institutionalizing the rule. This is rule consequentialist in an institutional sense. An act is right because it falls under the institutionalized rule. There is another variant of rule consequentialism where it is sufficient that it would be of good consequence if everybody would do the same. This is not about institutionalizing things. It's almost Kantian. It's counterfactual. An example is, keep your promise is morally justified if and only if it has consequences if you do keep the promise in this instance of decision making. That's the act consequentialist view. It is morally justified because promise keeping falls under a rule which has good consequences, namely the rule keep your promises. And this is if the rule is institutionalized by social practices, rule consequentialist, and it is counterfactually rule consequentialist if we would say it would have good consequences if everybody would follow that rule. The chief example of a consequentialist conception is utilitarianism. It's a specific form of consequentialism which would evaluate acts or rules in terms of the non-moral consequences. This is something which is not itself a moral thing like breaking a promise. It is the consequence here as, say, pleasure and pain, hedonistic, happiness, called eudaimonistic. Happiness is something different from pleasure and pain. You can have other sources of happiness, or it is, in modern variants, preference satisfaction in the so-called preference utilitarian approaches. These non-moral consequences are decisive for what is right or wrong. Utilitarianism is further characterized by what I would call the principle of equivalence. Whether you bring about good consequences by your actions or by your omissions does not matter. The consequences matter if they are causally affected by the alternatives on which you happen to decide. So, if you push somebody down a cliff or let him fall down the cliff, even though you could have prevented the fall, this amounts basically to the same thing. If you let people die in the third world, according to this logic, this is as bad as actively killing them. There are certain other aspects to it, but fundamentally this is the logic. And according to this logic, some of the strongest supporters of help for the so-called world and other great ethical causes are utilitarians. And there's something else which is very important, namely the so-called principle of substitution. Whether something ceteris paribus is good or is located as a good in the individual J or the individual K does not matter. Whether Mr. A has pleasure or Mr. B, as long as the amount of pleasure is the same, it does not matter who gets it. Everybody counts the same. Everybody is treated in a generalized equal manner. So, as long as the sum of happiness or the sum of pleasure or the sum of preference satisfaction in the world remains the same, we can take away something and give it to somebody else. And the moral evaluation of the state of the world does not change. That means that we can legitimately take away from some to give it to others if this increases the overall utility. The principle of substitution leads to this summing of utilities, or is behind it, characterizes a class of functions and so on, and it is very, very closely related to something all ethicists agree: ethics should be universalist. It doesn't matter who is to gain and who is to lose. We look at the world from an impartial point of view. Just as a final remark, I personally do not believe in ethical universalism. I believe that an adequate ethical position would be partisan for certain interests. However, I agree that many people then would say, I am not supporting an ethical system at all. I don't think that this is legitimate, but this is a controversy that should be discussed in detail in a different context and not in a crash course on moral theory. For those who have heard about this and have seen the examples, trolley, drug and the patient in room 207 are all of the kind that has been made popular in the discussion of utilitarianism and the pros and cons of it. Is the difference between consequentialism and non-consequentialism really as relevant as most people think? Yes, in some sense it is relevant in organizing our thoughts. However, directly it is of much lesser importance than we think. The whole thing that we have already encountered in discussing shareholder versus stakeholder value, and that these two positions, if we look at the practical consequences in specific institutional terms and so on, converge, repeats itself here. Indirect consequentialism is something which we arrive at if we look at things in an institutional perspective. Indirect consequentialism says implement certain rules because the implementation of these rules will have good consequences. However, a constitutive part of these rules is that the person acting under the rule is supposed to apply the rule and not look at the consequences. Chief example of this, rule of law. Rule of law means you implement the rules of law, and then rule of law is that you just apply the law as the wording of the law stipulates. You do not justify your subsumption of a special case under the legal rule by the specific consequences of this subsumption. That would be act consequentialist. No, you justify it by conformity to the rule. And the rule itself is then justified by the good consequences it has if law is really observed in a society. And as we know, all rich societies are societies under rule of law. Nothing can make a society poor more swiftly than breaking the rule of law and subverting it. There are, to take the other side, deontological views that are implicitly consequentialist. To explain, indirect consequentialism actually justifies to act as if one would be an adherent of deontological theories, non-consequentialist theories, namely, because you don't look at the consequences. It's right or wrong according to the rule. Deontological views that think that acts are right or wrong in themselves, or rules are right or wrong in themselves, are often presented in an implicitly consequentialist form. That happens always if you have two prima facie valid principles involved. Say you are promised to help your friend in moving the furniture, then promise keeping is involved, and at the same time you move by a person who is dying on the wayside, and then you say, okay, I have to help this person. Now you have a conflict, the conflict with the principle you should help others and the principle you should keep your promises. Now how could you resolve the controversy? Typically you would do it in terms of consequences, even though you are a deontologist in some sense. All reasonable approaches will have to make concessions to the other side in search of wider equilibrium. What can you conclude from this? Be coherent. Whenever you can, go for a more general perspective that transcends your day-to-day pragmatic decision making. Just look at things from a point above to be more systematic, and presumably do this actually in the spirit of risk management, in the spirit of enlarging your view. This is ethical perspectives as a means to be a better manager. Always try to support what you do by the most general principles you can find. Why is that so? Well, that makes you think more systematically, that makes you learn better from your experiences, because special experiences then all relate to the same general principle. This was a very short way towards ethics. Anybody who is interested in the subject should bear in mind that some ethical theory must be read. But adapting a famous saying of Kant, we should also say that ethics without theories is blind, but ethics without cases is empty, and that also applies to business ethics.